Okay, looking at the organisational culture, which we've been discussing already, just want to summarise Charles Handy's model. This is something which we discussed earlier on in class, and it's taken from his book Gods of Management, and it's a really important model to be familiar with when studying any form of management. Very useful for you to know. So if we think about the model, it's actually a model of 4 cultural types. We have a power culture, a task culture, a person culture, and a role culture. And these cultures are closely linked with the way that organisations are formally structured. With Handy's model, it's categorised by the level of obedience, initiative, the time or task orientation, how tasks are allocated and by whom, the source of control. Is it coming from an individual? Is it coming from a committee? Just how intense is it? The rules and regulations, are there many in number? Are they very rigid? Or actually are there very few? And the attitudes to eccentric or non-standard behaviour, or even attitudes to dress, their dress code. And do the management offer an open or a closed door style? If we think of power culture to start off with, power culture is often very much described as the web. Power is concentrated often to one or to a few people to make key decisions. There tends to be a high level of obedience, and it usually takes place in a small firm or a part of a large business. And it works on the basis that the closer to the spider, closer to the web, the more influence you have. It's very much focused on results, and often there's the need to guess the expectations of the manager. Something to think about in the power culture is whether you think it's right or wrong. Do you think there's likely to be a high turnover of staff? And do you think it's actually easy to grow? If we considered the role culture, and the role culture is generally typified by a Greek temple to represent bureaucracy. Rules are seen as more important than individuals, and really efficiency relies on the coherent division of roles. There would be clear, specified job descriptions, very specified, with no options for creativity. There would be strong functional divisions, and very much opportunities to specialise. Generally, it will be coordinated by a group of senior managers, and it could be argued that there's actually very limited flexibility for the individual. And it does tend to be that most public sector organisations operate like this, and there's difficulty in collaborating across role areas, and this makes change and innovation quite difficult. If we were to consider task culture, and it's often shown as a lattice or a net, showing close links with other teams. There's very much an emphasis on teams getting tasks done, and there's a tendency to disintegrate into power or into role cultures. There's collaboration between specialisms and skills, and different teams are formed for different projects. It really suits a fast response, innovation, short product lifestyle. And I'll give you, for example, NASA. NASA had a task to put the man on the moon. There can be issues with control. Who's in charge? And perhaps with a scarcity of resources, actually managers do seek power, influence and control through this task culture. One thing with task culture is actually you get very much a distinct team culture develops, and I think this is because the team is empowered to make decisions, and task cultures are actually very creative. Finally, we'll look at person culture, and person culture is actually very uncommon, and it can be found in some specialist areas of larger organisations, perhaps IT specialists, hospital consultants. I think you could think about person culture being the all about me culture. The structure only exists to serve the individuals, and individual workers with some shared services. It's easy to find alternative employment, and there's low institutional loyalty. It could be in consultancies or partnerships, and it's relatively rare as an organisation. And actually, it could actually have a whole host of microcultures operating within it. I think it's fair to say it's the most individualistic form of culture. If we look at this summary sheet, and if we turn to the top left-hand corner, you see we begin by looking at the different cultures, the power, the role, the task, the person, and along the top, grouped it up into obedience, initiative, who sets the task, the supervision, the decisions and the rules. So we can see with the power culture, it's subject to employees having a very high level of obedience, but equally a high level of initiative. Tasks are set centrally, limited supervision, and decisions tend to be made centrally, and there's very few formal rules. If we were to look at the role culture, it's a high level of obedience expected again, but the initiative is very low. Very much you know what your job is, you get on and do with it. Tasks set by a supervisor with close supervision, and decisions are made by a committee, and often many rules. On the task culture, well, there tends to be a low level of obedience and a high level of initiative, and that's because we're doing tasks set by a team. Decisions are made by the team, and there's very little independent supervision. Very few rules. And then finally, looking at the person culture, low levels of obedience, high initiative, you set the task, you supervise yourself. There could be some joint decisions, and the rules are very flexible. And culture change involves moving an organisation on from one culture to another, usually through a culture change program. And I think, as you can probably imagine, it can be quite difficult to actually change the culture sometimes.